All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second in our series, Food for Thought series. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Cohen. He's going to be speaking on the sustainability of sustainability. And I'm just going to do a quick run through of our instructions for the session, just so that we can keep this running smoothly and everyone has a chance to speak. As you all know, we're going to have a Q&A session, but that's going to be towards the end. So we're going to start off with Dr. Cohen's summary of his points in his sustainability paper, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, please feel free to do so. Just raise your hand. And if you don't know how to do so, you can go to the left-hand corner at the bottom and click on participants and you can raise your hand. And if you have any questions about how to use any of the controls on Zoom, just send me a message on the chat, and the chat's at the bottom. And then we're going to spotlight those students, first the speaker, Dr. Cohen, and then we'll move on to highlight those students who raised their questions. So I think if we don't have any questions about how Zoom works, and if you have any questions about the instructions, then we'll move on to Dr. Cohen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have no problem with Zoom. I live on it. I actually think that when I get to real life and people are no longer tiles, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to deal with it anymore. Let's see. So where do I start? I guess I start with, so this was I write a weekly blog for the State of the Planet, the Earth Institute's website blog. And this one that Bill asked me to talk about was one which I call the sustainability of sustainability. And what this is really about is that there are two forms of sustainability management. One, which is essentially what I would call greenwashing and public relations, and the other, which is really as a management principle. And it really stems from the concept of corporate social responsibility, which is a big thing these days, but I think is an oxymoron. Corporations are not supposed to be socially responsible. They're supposed to make money. Government's job is to regulate corporations so they're socially responsible. Now, it's good if they're socially responsible on their own. I think it's a terrific thing, but I don't expect it. That's what rule of law is about. That's what regulation is about. And so there's a whole enterprise in corporate social responsibility. A lot of students studying it, a lot of students going into the private sector because they want to do good. But I can tell you, having been in the private sector a lot in my life, including growing up in it, my father was a corporation president, companies are about making money, which is good. That's actually what they're supposed to do. And government is supposed to be about the public interest and protecting and inspiring companies to do the right thing. So the idea that sustainability is somehow linked in to corporate social responsibility is a way of dooming it. To me, you want to link sustainability to the basics of management. So the basics of management are using what can you use to control and influence the organization, and what can you do to make the organization more effective, customer related, and efficient. And I believe sustainability is one of those principles. And that's why I focus on what I call the physical dimensions of environmental sustainability, as opposed to this sort of general concept of sustainability, which essentially means nothing. So what I mean by this is energy efficiency, the use of renewable energy, the use of as little material as possible so that you don't waste, recycling, and actually designing into the production of goods and services the least possible use of resources, and in fact, if it's a product, so that it can be reused. So an example I would give you is something called the Xerox machine. So Xerox, in case you don't know, it doesn't sell copiers, they lease them. And after 5 years, they take them back, and they're designed so that 80% of the parts in that machine can be used in the next version of the machine. Apple these days is paying you to give back your iPhone so they can mine the pieces of the iPhone, particularly the rare metals that have become expensive. And so the concept of sustainability is really linked to the concept of the circular economy, which is to try to bring back into production everything that you can. The analogy I often use is my grandmother and a chicken. My grandmother, when she had a chicken, made sure every part of that chicken was eaten. Even parts you don't even want to describe, somehow ended up in soup or stew or unmentionable food that none of us really wanted to know about. So nothing got thrown out, okay? Now in contrast, I don't know if you know, I went to graduate school in Buffalo where the chicken wing was invented. In fact, a bar near me, the Anchor Bar, is where they invented it. And they invented it by taking the parts of the chicken that used to get thrown out, known as the wing, and frying it up, putting it for free on the bar with hot sauce, and the goal was to sell beer. Now, if my grandmother had gotten hold of that chicken, there never would have been chicken wings, okay? But in the case of the Anchor Bar, we got this famous delicacy, and they sold a lot of beer as a result, because the one thing chicken wings do is they make you really thirsty. Same reason you'll never get anything but salty peanuts at a bar. They'll never have salt-free peanuts. Same basic point. So sustainability is a management concept. In our new book, Professor Emick and I have just published, or at least Columbia Press is publishing, called Management Fundamentals, we actually have a chapter about sustainability as a management concept. So basically, that's really what the point I'm trying to make is that sustainability is like budgeting, it's like performance measurement, it's like any management concept. It's something that you use to make the organization work better. Now, it turns out that people, particularly young people, are motivated. They want to work for organizations that do less damage to the environment because you're going to live long enough to actually have to deal with the impact of climate change. Professor Emick and I will be long gone before New York's underwater. Miami's already underwater a lot of days. And so you have an interest in protecting the environment that has nothing to do with organizational efficiency, which is great, and with organizational management, which is great. And I have no problem with protecting the environment because we need the planet. It's a great thing. I've been devoted to environmental protection since 1975 when I first took a course in environmental politics from a fellow named Lester Milbrath. And since 1977 when I worked at the EPA. So I worked at EPA when I was 7 years old. There is nothing I think of as more important than the environment, but I would separate the issue of management from my concern for environmental protection. Sustainability is essentially a management concept. So I don't know if there's anything else from that piece that is worth mentioning, but I'd be happy to take questions and get into conversation if I've said anything that sparks your interest.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Do we have any questions, any comments?
How can I raise my hand? I don't have a raise my hand button.
Just raise your hand. Just do this,
That's
Bill.
fine. Do this. That's fine too.
So, Professor Cohen, obviously I agree with everything you say always. That's how I'm still around at Columbia. But if all of private sector CEOs don't get it yet, which I think is true, should government be more aggressive in terms of giving tax incentives, understanding that regulation is difficult? There are a lot of people in Congress who are opposed to it, libertarians, whatever. So it's probably more likely, if you were going to get legislation, particularly today, it'd be on the carrot side rather than on the stick side.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a good idea? And do you have any suggestions for where we could be more aggressive?
Yes, you may recall, Professor Emick, you and I and Alison Miller wrote a book on this very subject called Sustainability Policy.
Yes.
And in sustainability policy, we identify all the things that the government should be doing to encourage the use of sustainability concepts in organizations and to bring about, in particular, decarbonization of our economy. So there's absolutely no question about the fact that government should be intervening, because one of government's roles is to try to encourage good behavior. I mean, the analogy that I'm using a lot these days, particularly when I think about sustainability metrics, is actually generally accepted accounting practices. And so the story of the Great Depression is really had to do with a stock market crash that happened in the late 1920s, because at that point we did not yet have generally accepted accounting practices. So every corporation could report whatever they wanted to about what their finances were. And that meant that going to the stock market was like playing in the casino. In fact, Joseph Kennedy, who was the first head of the SEC, famously said when his shoeshine boy was explaining to him that he was in the market, that it was time for him to get out. He cashed out before the crash. He said, when this guy knows that much about the stock market, there's something wrong with it. So after the crash, FDR put Joe Kennedy in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And one of the first things they did was develop accounting practices that every corporation needed to follow if they wanted to have publicly traded stock. That was a very important and historic intervention in the private marketplace, because now everybody defined revenues and expenses in the same way. And that meant that if you read a corporate audited report, you actually knew whether or not that company was making or losing money. So that's an example of government intervention in the marketplace. In fact, this idea that the right has been perpetrating that capitalism is one thing and government's another, and they have nothing to do with each other, is complete nonsense. The only reason the United States has the kind of economy it has is a very careful and important government intervention in the marketplace. And if we're going to bring about sustainability, we're going to need the same kinds of interventions. And I think that will be, we're seeing that at the state and local level. We're not seeing much of it at the national level right now.
Are there one or two tax incentives or benefits you would, that off the top of your head, that you would say should be targeted, or Biden should be talking about in his campaign, or the senators who are running?
Well, I think a lot of the stuff you see in the Green New Deal is correct, but what I would start with would be subsidies for solar energy and for energy efficiency, tax incentives, tax credits, and so on. I would also get rid of the oil depletion allowance. We are subsidizing fossil fuels still to this day in this country. It's the most ridiculous thing imaginable. And I would also, not so much on the regulatory side, but I think investment in infrastructure. Our electrical grid is a century old. Modernizing the electrical grid, using microgrids and smart grids to try to make the energy grid much more efficient. We waste about a third of the energy we generate before we use it. Those kinds of things would be very helpful government interventions in making a more sustainable economy.
Thank you, Professor Cohen.
Thank you.
I have a question.
So, yes.
Oh, hi. I think I'm already unmuted, so sorry about that. Steve, I wonder if you might comment on the fashion industry, since it is almost defined by lack of sustainability. And, I've become much more aware of my own excess clothing and shoes, since I don't have to wear most everything just sitting there not being worn over the past few months. And it's, just very much been on, I think, a lot of people's minds that how can this industry be sustained, and should it be? And it's a huge industry.
Well, I'd start with a company that one of my graduates is the head of sustainability on, called Rent the Runway. I don't know if you've ever heard of this company, but what Rent the Runway does is it rents clothing, particularly to women, that you can get a subscription for like $150 a month, and every week they send you 4 new outfits, and so you can, and they're all high fashion, $1,000 clothing, but they reuse them over and over again until they wear out. One of the things about fashion is that a lot of the fashion ends up staying in your closet. You buy it, and then 6 months later you stop wearing it because it's no longer in style. So that's one model. The other thing, and I have a lot of students in my sustainability management program very interested in fashion and sustainable fashion, because fashion is a part of our culture. It's really important. And part of what you can do is start making materials that have less toxics in them. You can develop a closed system so that at a certain point, when the clothing is worn, it can be essentially recycled. But I think the key with fashion is to use less plastic and chemicals in the process. We've seen some examples of dyeing processes and weaving processes that are less destructive of the environment. And I think we'll be seeing more of those in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one of our guests has their hand up. Just going to spotlight.
Thanks,
Go ahead.
Jeremy.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed a lot of articles coming out about how sustainable funds and ESG funds, in parallel with all of the loosening restrictions coming from the government on how we deal with the environment, have been outperforming other funds. And I think that illuminates how there could also be pressure coming from the financial sector on incorporating ESG and sustainable management principles into businesses. And I wonder what you think about that and how that can be promoted by the government.
Well, I mean, I think part of this is happening, my colleague Satajit Bose and Dong Gua, along with, actually I'm forgetting her name, but the woman who's the head of the sustainability for the California Pension Fund, written a book on sustainability finance that came out last spring. And there are, in fact, profit reasons to be investing in sustainable businesses. And part of it is a business that doesn't take into account environmental risk, doesn't take into account climate risk, and doesn't think about the cost of energy and of waste is by definition a less efficient company. And so I think that in a sense, sustainability is really a surrogate for good management. I mean, there are people who've defined environmental protection as an add-on at the end of the production process. And that's really where some of the mythology of environmental protection comes from. The idea, in order to, the early days of pollution control, we put technology onto polluting things like cars and power plants that added to the cost of the power plant, okay, or added to the cost of the automobile. But then what happened, and it's an interesting kind of thing, take an automobile today. So an automobile that gets good gas mileage is by definition a more efficient machine on the road. If I get 50 miles to the gallon and you get 20 miles to the gallon, my cost of operating is lower. Electric cars are the same thing. Electric cars have fewer moving parts than an internal combustion engine. And one of the reasons why service stations don't like them is they don't break down very often. And so, sustainability is often associated with higher technology, more efficient, and really more cost effectiveness. And so investments in those kinds of companies will have the tendency to pay off better when they're done well. Now, again, so much of this stuff is propaganda. In the Great Recession, the Obama administration invested a lot of money in renewable energy, and one or two of the companies fail. But if you actually look at the federal government's success rate after the Great Recession in investment, they're far better than almost anybody else. And there's all this right-wing mythology. Oh, you're picking winners and losers, and government shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. But in fact, every government subsidy since we started them picks winners and losers. In American history, one of the winners we picked early on was agriculture. So we built land-grant colleges and we invested in agricultural technology. We built canals like the Erie Canal. We built ports and terminals and trains so that we could ship our produce and outside of the country. And that's really where the first excess capital in the United States comes from. It comes from our incredible bounty of food. And it was government that saw that and took advantage of it. So, getting back to the issue of sustainability really just means, we increase the production of our economy and we do it without destroying the environment. But why wouldn't you do that? Why would you want to, this idea that somehow the only way you can grow your economy is by destroying the planet is moronic. I mean, you end up paying for it anyway. you know, one of my jobs in EPA in 1979-80 was working in the Superfund program, and which was toxic waste cleanup. And one of the things that we discovered is there were 50,000 toxic waste sites around the United States. 50,000, that was just on civilian land. The government had another 50,000. And we've actually spent, since 1980, almost $1 trillion. And we call it cleaning up waste sites. We don't actually know how to do it. What we've done is contain the waste and gotten people out of harm's way. Now, had we had more effective toxics waste policies to begin with, we wouldn't have had to spend that $1 trillion. What else could we have used $1 trillion with since 1980? Part of what's gone, and this is really what's so important about public policy, is you have to think a little bit ahead. And Bill Gates has been talking for a decade about pandemics, discovering emerging disease, and building a robust public health system. And guess what? Obama was listening, and we actually had one in place before it got dismantled by the current president. The World Health Organization, before it got into the kind of trouble because of some of its mistakes with China and the United States, was actually reasonably effective. You need government to play a role in protecting us. And whether it's from pandemics or pollution, this is how you make for a more effective and efficient economy. And sustainability can operate at the organizational level, can operate at the governmental level, and it can operate at the national and global level. And all these concepts are incredibly important.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, can I have a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Professor. So my question is, could you, because the corporate is responsible for the sustainable development, maybe this the corporation is kind of the frontier, the main player for the sustainable development. So could you please explain more international cooperation level? So how the international organizations can set the international standard for all the cooperation to follow. Another concern came out is, so if all, for example, for the agriculture product, if the US government give to some tax or subsidiary incentives for the corporation to produce a good agriculture product and then export it to the other countries, is there, maybe this question is too theoretical, is there a kind of possibility that the foreign government will going to raise the anti-subsidiary policy? Because in that case, the good product might be exported to the other country at a lower price. So that's my question. First is, could you please help us explain more from the international cooperation level? Another question is about if the corporation get these kind of tax or subsidiary incentives, is there going to be, are they going to face some international challenges from other countries?
Well, first, national self-interest and corporate self-interest are never going to go away. International organizations play an important role in trying to figure out places where common interests can be brought together and agreements can come about for that reason. And we've had pretty successful international organizations in issues like trade and communications, and in certain kinds of arms control. We've had less successful in other areas. One of the things that we are seeing, China, for example, is selling a lot of coal-fired power plants in Africa. This is unethical, and it's bad practice. At the same time, they're trying to reduce the amount of coal-fired power plants in China, which I think is a good idea because they need more energy and they should be using renewable energy. There is a tendency to use old technology and dump it into developing countries. This is a bad thing. I don't think that international organizations can stop it. I think that media attention and social efforts can sometimes bring pressure to bear on governments. But I think that in essence, you have to depend on national governments to protect their people, and you have to depend on corporations to make money. And so the real action, if you want to prevent polluting businesses from operating in the developing world, it's not going to happen because of international organizations. It's going to happen because of national governments. And the way I would put this is environmental sustainability and environmental protection is a kind of stage of development. So, China has gone through an intense period of development, and they got to the point where you couldn't see the buildings in Beijing. And because the elite in China, the media, the governmental and corporate elite all have to live there, air pollution moved up in the political agenda. Same thing happened here in Pittsburgh and Los Angeles and New York, and that led to the Clean Air Act. That led to radically improved air quality in the United States compared to the 1960s. But when people have to choose between feeding their children and environmental protection, they choose feeding the children. Okay, now there shouldn't be a trade-off like that, but there's a perceived trade-off like that. And early in the stages of development, we see that. Then you get to a point where you no longer worry about feeding your children because it's been happening, you figure it's going to happen. So now you start to worry about something called wellness. And that's what happened in this country. So originally we passed the Clean Air Act because we were worried that states would compete for dirty industry. And what happened? Well, they did for a while, and then the Clean Air Act put that to a close. And then the pressure for environmental protection came from the community. Something called NIMBY, the not in my backyard syndrome, rises up because, in a place like New York, you can't locate an Amazon headquarters. You can't locate, a big box store. Forget about a dirty factory. And people want to make sure that their children are eating well, are exercising, and aren't breathing toxic fumes. That pressure for environmental protection is a stage of development. You're going to see that in the developing world as some of the basic necessities get met. One of the things that I was encouraged by was because of Millennium Development Goals and other efforts at the national level, extreme poverty was going down until COVID-19 came in. And hopefully when COVID-19 leaves, extreme poverty will leave at the same rate it's been leaving. Once we get rid of that, I think you can count on local forces fighting for a cleaner environment, because this is not an ideological. It's sort of like people say, "Well, I don't believe in climate change." What's to believe it? I mean, it's a fact. I don't believe that in COVID-19. We've seen that people not wearing masks. What do you mean that you don't believe it? I don't believe in a virus. I mean, the virus is there. Climate change is there. These are scientific facts. Pollution is there. So the question is, what do you do about it? And the answer to that is not always, I have climate scientist friends who say, well, let's shut down the economy. And I remember I had a debate with this fellow, Jim Hansen, who was one of the great climate scientists. He's part of an organization called 350.org, which was to lower the rate of carbon dioxide pollution to 350 parts per million. We're now at about 400. If you did that, you would start a worldwide depression. After the worldwide depression, you'd have terrorism, you'd have riots in the streets, and you'd be nostalgic for sea level rise. It would seem benign compared to a dirty bomb in Times Square. In other words, all of these systems are interconnected. And so when you think about COVID-19 right now. Should we have shut down the economy the way we did? Now, that's a policy choice. I happen to think that doing it for a few months was a good idea. It clearly drove down the rate of infection. Now the question is, what do we do now? The same thing is true of any threat, any kind of environmental threat, any kind of public health threat. These are matters that should be subject to policy choice and a real assessment of cost and benefits. What we're getting, unfortunately, is nonsense out of this idiot in the White House, who nobody trusts and nobody believes. And so, he wants to have big rallies. He doesn't care if anybody gets sick. So it's hard to trust. But in fact, the choice of what do we do about a crisis, whether it's COVID-19 or it's toxics or other kinds of environmental protection, those are all things that we have to really weigh and judge. And it has to be done with care and analysis, knowing that there's no free lunch, there's no easy choice. Sometimes you have to say, we're going to accept this hit to get this benefit. And that's, we need, we're in a complex global economy with almost 8 billion people on the planet. We're going to be facing threats for all of our lives, and those threats aren't going to go away. So we need to be vigilant, we need to be smart, we need to invest in public infrastructure to protect us, and we need to use it. And it needs to be done without, riling up political and emotional turmoil over nothing, which is unfortunately what we have right now in the world. It's very hard to have a sophisticated discussion about what to do when we have all this ridiculousness that we have to deal with all the time. So I've gotten a little off topic.
Thank you. I think we have Professor Weinberger next. Hello. You're on mute. Let's see.
About whether the emergency we've been going through with COVID-19 has caused you to re-examine some of your own thinking on sustainability. Have there been surprises or developments in the emergency or the response to it that have led you to re-examine some of your premises? And also from the paper, I was just wondering, when you think about sustainability goals, do health concerns, global public health, figure prominently, in ordinary times, or are they relatively marginal?
Well, first, my thinking, if anything, has been reinforced. My thinking about sustainability is really based on, we live in a complex, dangerous world. We need to understand the science of sustainability, just like we need to understand the science of pandemics. We need to develop systems that are governmental and public-private partnerships to make sure that we can protect ourselves. COVID-19 could have been contained. It jumped out of China because of frankly, a set of political decisions that were unethical. It wasn't acted on early enough in the United States, which could have been because they dismantled the parts of CDC and the National Security Council that were ready to deal with it. That's the first problem. And the second problem is it became this symbolic thing. And the president refused to accept the fact that this could happen and could happen dramatically because he's a scientific illiterate. Anybody who understands science and understands what a pandemic looks like and how quickly it can multiply would understand that, but he didn't. And so I guess what I'm saying is that policy decision makers need to become more scientifically literate and sophisticated. They need to understand it. On the other hand, just as I wouldn't listen to climate scientists on everything to do about the economy, I wouldn't listen to public health experts on everything to do with public health. There are other values that we have to weigh in the balance, but they have to be weighed. They can't just be dealt with in this emotional way. Now, in a very crude and rough way, that's really what's happening. It's happening, thankfully, in the United States because of federalism. If we didn't have a federal system here, God knows what would be going on. But we've had responsible governments at the state level, in many places, California, to some degree, New York, Michigan, other places that have been very careful about what they've done. And as a result, some of the studies that are coming out today indicate that millions of people are alive because of these decisions. But the fundamental problems were that it shouldn't have happened in the first place. In other words, a more effective global health system would have contained this pandemic. The way you do it before you have a vaccine is you isolate the people who get it, and you do it quickly, and you acknowledge it's going on. And if you do it well, there won't be that many people catching it, and you can prevent it from becoming a global pandemic. That's really, I think at this point, having spent trillions of dollars in the world to deal with this, I think the idea of spending a few billion to fix it is probably sounding okay. And the way I've been thinking about it is, it's a little bit like what happened after 9/11. The whole security industry became prominent. So you want to get into a building in Midtown Manhattan, and they take your picture. In some places, they run a security check. They look at your driver's license. So they make sure you're not carrying a weapon or a bomb. Now they're going to do biological scans. They're going to make sure you're not carrying a disease. And that technology is going to get better and better, and there'll be more and more of it. You know, and I think how the world's changed. When I first came to Columbia, I used to fly to Washington every week on something called the air shuttle. And you basically could walk on the airplane. There was no security. Sometimes you even bought your ticket on the plane. You know, they didn't worry about us blowing up the planes back then. Well, things changed, okay? That's gone, that world's gone. We've managed to survive the end of that world, okay? Eventually you get accommodations like TSA, pre-check, and things of that sort, so you can get through the lines a little faster. So I think we're going to see that with biological scanning, and I think people are going to take pandemics and disease much more seriously now than they used to. And the way I would put it is COVID-19 is not the last of these pandemics. And the reason we're going to have them is we're in a global economy. People travel all over the world, and they're going to go back to traveling all over the world. The advantages of the global economy, the efficiencies of it, of global supply chains are so great, they're not going to go away. And I think if you add to that a concern for environmental sustainability, those supply chains will become even better and more efficient and effective in producing wealth around the world.
Hey, Steve, so the US election is 5 months away. Do you think because of the pandemic and public health concerns and the whole myriad of issues in the Black Lives Matter and the policing and the protests that we see all over the country and the issues underlying that, whether it's affordable housing or jobs for all, healthcare for all, do you think this moves that what seemed to be a growing movement around climate change and sustainability and that which seemed to be emerging stronger and stronger, do you see that now being pushed back on the agenda and not being a part of the campaigns, not just for the president, but for the Senate and the Congress in the US and maybe other places as well?
No, I think they're all connected, actually. I mean, I think that this is, if you look at the Green New Deal, that's exactly what it's about. It's about connecting all of these things into a single policy framework. You know, you think about the original New Deal, the sources of the Depression. I mean, first, some of the original problems happened because of an environmental catastrophe called the Dust Bowl. And so agricultural productivity in the 20s was impaired because of a lack of understanding of soils, which we learned a lot about through the New Deal. So you worked on agricultural problems, you worked on labor problems, you worked on regulatory problems, public works, a whole range of things were brought together. I think all of these problems are interconnected. I mean, you know, you solve the pandemic problem, but you know, you're underwater. It doesn't do you, I mean, literally underwater, it doesn't do you much good. You have to think about all, you know, in the way I look at it, and the issue of race, which is a little bit different, but is connected in this sense. You know, race has been, there were two sources of wealth in America when it was created. One was agricultural technology and the other was slavery. The excess capital that created industrial America happened because of the slaves in the South and because of the agricultural extension that made our agriculture in the North and the Midwest so efficient that we were able to create export and excess capital. And that led to the industrialization in the United States. That was a very important source of American power. And we've never, in many respects, the movement toward environmental protection has dealt with some of the industrial era issues and the growth of the service economy as well. Now, this coming back and addressing the issue of race and equality and equal opportunity. I mean, for us, Bill, it's been part of our entire life. I was protesting for racial integration in my high school in 1968. You know, I remember, you know, leading a strike. You know, a third of the students in my high school came from East New York and Bedford-Stuyvesant, and they weren't busting because we didn't have buses, the subway. But the point is that there was tension in our high school, and a group of us worked together to try to address those issues. And that's, you know, over 50 years ago. And we've made progress, but not enough. And I think the fact that these issues are coming back is a healthy thing for the country. It's a very important thing for the country, and long overdue. And I think very good. And I think if you take what's happening in the streets, COVID, climate, sustainability, you wrap them all together, and you realize we need a government. We need to have a federal government. You know, in 1980, Ronald Reagan ran saying government's the problem. And for 4 decades, government at the federal level has become increasingly helpless. You know, now it's time to start investing resources and energy into the federal government again. Some of these problems have to be solved nationally. Some are state and local and community, but solving these problems without a national government has been very hard. And I think the issue of racism is a cultural issue as well as everything else. I think the most impressive thing about what's going on right now is if you look at these demonstrations, it's not like the early days of Black Lives Matter. It's a majority of the demonstrators are white, which is a really impressive and important part of the cultural phenomenon that we're seeing here today. I have to say that, you know, there are people who worry about, I mean, I was worried when I saw looting associated with it. It was very clear that 99% of the demonstrators had nothing to do with this, with the looting and all the rest of it. These have been incredibly peaceful demonstrations and very important for the country. I tend to be optimistic. I tend to think that we're going to move in the right direction on all of these issues. And it's always a matter in this country of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Last 3 years, it's been 2 steps back and 1 step forward, but I'm optimistic that this period is coming to an end. I sure hope it is.
Thank you. All right, I think we have Professor Gondek. Professor Gondek, she had her hand raised.
Sorry. Yes,
Okay.
I'm sorry my picture is not appearing. I have a different computer. I don't know what to do. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, I was just going to say in response to Naomi's interesting question, I think from my perspective of teaching ethics and environmental justice that there's always been a huge interface between sustainability, environmentalism, and health, but it did tend to take the form of physical health onslaughts, and that would be particulate matter and pollution. And now I think, for example, that the NIMBY idea that Professor Cohen mentioned is actually becoming a national kind of NIMBY because Singapore is very resentful and has passed policies against Indonesia for the burns and so on of the forests, because that affects the pollution very much over Singapore, for example. And as well, Hong Kong has been very angry at China for causing pollution to blow over them. In Australia, the indigenous people have been very angry. Also, it happens at China for the coal mining and so on. So a lot of that has to do with the particulate impact, but also the chemical impact on health. You know, from the toxic sites, the Superfund sites and so on has been a huge interface between health and environmental ethics and so on. But you're right, I think the biological did not have, you know, as huge of a presence. I think in that regard, like with viruses and particular bacteria, it tended, you know, that there was still a time for it to come. I think it has, you know, it come in the present time, but I do think that the precursors of the physical and chemical versus the viral and bacteria onslaughts is a you know, a kind of a forebear that we have to draw on for our experience, you know, basis and all for dealing with this. Anyway, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Adela.
Okay.
I think we have Katerina. Let's see.
Thanks, Jeremy. So one of the comments, Steve, that you made about the politicizing of climate change and of the coronavirus, and also of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that are going on. I understand that it's an election year, so that seems to be something that is unavoidable with the structure of the media today. But do you have any other comments on how this is held back or grouped in sustainability as a political issue? And now we see it happening with coronavirus and with the fight for equality, and what can be done, by the government, or what can be passed even, and how we can avoid having politicians kind of get away with, maybe like attending funeral services for families to, aid in their election or.
Sure. Well, I wrote another blog more recently about the media and social media and its effect on our culture. And it actually talks about how when we first had network news in the 1950s on television in the 60s, it was done by the networks as a public service in exchange for the bandwidth that the government regulated, and they lost money at it. And then on June 1st, 1980, Ted Turner started CNN, and what followed was Fox and then MSNBC, and the news became a business. And so that business is sort of like the old tabloid, if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, the whole idea is bad news as much as possible, as violent as possible, all the time. And, and you see this, all the time. It's like if you watch the Weather Channel, you think there's going to be a hurricane every 10 minutes. Because the whole idea is to attract eyes to bad news. If you look at the mass media, it looks like the entire world, I mean, yes, there have been demonstrations all over America, but in a country of 330 some odd million people, far less than 1 million people have been demonstrating. Now, of course, a demonstration is an active act, and so you don't expect a majority to be out in the streets, but just keep that in mind. I had, when New York was having the demonstrations in the few areas of violence, I had people calling me up from all over the country, am I in danger? I was nowhere, I couldn't, the only danger I was in was, too many birds flying on my fire escape because there's so few cars outside. The media image of the world and the reality of the world are different, and social media actually makes it worse. At least the media has fact-checking traditions coming from the newspapers, but the social media, Facebook, and Twitter is finally correcting some of the ridiculous stuff that's coming from the president's Twitter account. But just the same, there's no fact-checking in there. So it's very hard to have a democracy when you don't know what's real. That's not to say this is not this. Historically, there's always been propaganda in newspapers, and you could argue and remember the Maine and all this. There's all this. This is not a new kind of thing. The difference is the relentlessness of the mass and social media. It's around us every minute of the day, and so real life and media life and social media life are sometimes hard to tell the difference of it. And the odd part of the pandemic era is most of our interaction with each other is over Zoom and over these technologies. And so, it's what effect will this have on politics? So far, the effect has not been good. It's really been, a little bit of rattling around. But I think, I guess I have a fundamental belief that facts and truth come out one way or the other. And that's what I'm hopeful will happen in this political year. There are some objective facts to the political situation we're in America today. 40 million people that were employed in February are not employed today. 106,000 people are dead. Lots of people have contracted this virus. The temperature of the planet until recently was going up. Probably not going to go up as much this year because of the pandemic. So you have these actual facts that people experience. It's sort of like, If I experience air pollution, I can see it. Toxic waste coming into your basement, you can smell it. Those kinds of facts are very hard to refute. And so propaganda has to run up against the facts. And my hope is that that will affect politics. But we'll see.
Well, Steve, I usually share your optimism, but I'm a little bit more worried about this because I do everything you say I agree with. And I think it's a problem because where I used to look for some sanity, whether it's the New York Times or CNN, you see the same kind of exaggeration. Things are always soaring. Conflict is always escalating. People
Right.
are fighting. There seems to be no interest in saying what you just said. Okay, understand, people feel deeply, people have concerns, but let's try to strip away a little bit of that and say, what is the core issue? What are the facts and what can we do about it?
Right.
Instead, people are just constantly bombarded. And I think even more problematic, people then tend to choose the media outlet that has the bias that they share.
Right.
And then so they just get egged on to say, yeah, not only am I right, but they're wrong.
Right. And I think one of the roles,
it's hard to find common ground.
I think one of the roles of leadership is to try to cut through that. I mean, I thought it was very significant yesterday when, there's this demand to defund the police. And you saw Joe Biden say, no, I'm not in favor of defunding the police. I'm in favor of connecting federal funds for police to a more effective, more humane, more just policing. So that's the role of leaders. I think Barack Obama did that constantly when he was president. I think it's one of the roles of leadership is to try to do that kind of truth telling. And when we don't have it, we really suffer. And I think it is an issue. There's no question about it. But I think what gives me a little bit of hope is we have a generation of people much younger than you and me, Bill, that have grown up on the social media. And I think they're a little bit better at distinguishing the baloney from reality. And I think the problem with social media is actually people that didn't grow up with it, that take it, that don't really interpret it correctly. But we will see what happens. I mean, I think this is a new phenomenon in the world, and its impact is only beginning to be seen, and it cuts across everything.
Well, I think we're close to the end. I want to thank you, Professor Cohen, for taking time out to speak with us and hash out, these different points of your sustainability. I want to thank our professors and faculty and students who joined us today. And hopefully we'll have this speaker series throughout the summer. Next week, we have a special series session on Black Lives Matter and policy. And we're going to address that with Professor Basil Smikle. And it's going to be held exceptionally at 11 next week. So I'm going to be sending along the paper this week, and then hopefully you'll all tune in next week and come with questions and concerns. And we're happy to see you all. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.